Hello, I'm Michael Burrows. I'm Assistant Director of the Rock Ethics Institutes. I'm here today with Dr. Melanie Killen, who is visiting Penn State today to deliver the 2014 Richard B. Lippin Lecture. We're very happy to have Dr. Killen here, so welcome. And would you mind introducing yourself?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to give my lecture. I am a professor of human development and quantitative methodology at the University of Maryland at College Park. And this afternoon I'll be talking about my research, which is in the area of morality, intentionality, and intergroup relationships.
So the first question, in the social policy report, you discussed the impact of prejudice and bias on children. Can you tell us what current research identifies as some of the most salient of these impacts and their effects in the lives of children?
It's profound, it's very important, and there's been a lot more research to look at this in terms of the effects of prejudice on children. It affects them at different ages, and it depends on their own environment and their own family environment. But clearly kids who are in, say, from an ethnic minority background and experiencing prejudice and discrimination, they're not necessarily aware of it at first, but what we see, the symptoms of that are some social withdrawal sometimes. Sometimes there's some depression, anxiety. Over time what happens is kids experience a lot of prejudice and discrimination, often lose motivation to go to school. And sometimes you might think, well, why would that be connected? Well, school's a social context, and it's a very intense social context. You're interacting with kids all the time, children your own age. And if you're feeling that they don't like you for some reason that you're not really sure about it, you don't really know why it is, that's demoralizing, but it also contributes to low motivation. As children start to pick up on why it might be that they're being prejudiced, because of the color of the skin, because of the language they speak, because of their religion, that also contributes to a new layer of negative consequences and outcomes because they start to see how unfair it is. It's one thing if you're excluded from the track team because you're a slow runner. Well, you're a slow runner. You still feel bad about it. But you do understand that there's agreed upon criteria for what it means to be part of the track team. But if you're going to school and they don't like you just because of the color of your skin, what was agreed upon about that? Nothing. Mm-hmm. And so it sets in a new level of sort of negative consequences mm-hmm. for children.
So in your response there, what's striking to me is that it kind of reflects this understanding that children actually are quite self-aware about prejudice and bias in their life. And I mentioned that there's a quotation from the report I wanted to read because it goes to this point. It says that contrary to what some theories have predicted or what some adults might expect, children experience and perceive discrimination, social exclusion, bias, and prejudice. They are not immune to it, nor are they oblivious to it. And I'm wondering if you could say more about what theories you have in mind here that discount children's understanding of bias and prejudice, and also why do you think it's so common that people do discount children's awareness of prejudice and bias?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It has to do with a lot of factors. The theories that have expected that children aren't aware of prejudice and bias are those that think about prejudice and bias as being part of the adult world. So they think that being discriminated against because of your religion or because of the language you speak has to do with adults in the workplace, in politics, and who can become president, although that's changed more recently in the United States. But nonetheless, they think about it as an adult level issue. So theories have tended to predict that young children, the problems with young children, the conflicts they have are bullying and victimization. Yes, they have bullying and victimization, but it has to do with things like a victim who's shy and fearful, has a personality that's they become a target, and that a bully is somebody who doesn't read cues well, insists on their own way, and that it's a personality issue, and it's a problem with children not learning social skills. So most of the time in the past, this idea was that young children don't experience the prejudice that adults experience. They are victimized, but for different reasons. And what the current research has shown, and by current I really mean the last 15 years, it's not real current, but it's current in the history of developmental psychology and child development research, the new findings show that that's not quite the case, that young children and children both experience and perpetuate exclusion and prejudice based on these kinds of categories. How they do is very different from adults, and they may not use explicit stereotypes, or they may, children who are victims of it may not even realize that why it is that they're being victimized, but they do experience it.
Mm-hmm. So from kind of children's awareness of prejudice and bias, this next question is about thinking about ways in which the impacts of prejudice and bias can be reduced. And in the policy report, you focus quite a bit on the contact hypothesis. Can you tell me more about this hypothesis and why you feel it is an important area of focus in learning to combat prejudice and bias in children?
Intergroup contact is a theory that Gordon Allport wrote about in The Nature of Prejudice, a book he wrote in 1954 after World War II, and trying to understand prejudice and how it emerges. And he formulated this hypothesis that intergroup contact could reduce prejudice, that is, contact with members of the outgroup. But he wrote, which was wise because it's been verified and played out in the research literature, contact alone is not enough to reduce prejudice. Just because you interact with somebody from a different religion or race doesn't mean that that reduces your prejudice. So what is it about that contact that would help that? And he identified 4 conditions. And the first condition was authority sanctioning. So in his mind, he referred to sort of society, governments, leaders, being on board with the goals of mutual respect and integration. In developmental psychology and child development research, we have interpreted that to mean teachers, principals, parents, being on board with the goals of integration and mutual respect. So that's one condition, authority sanctioning. The second is common goals. Having individuals work together on a common problem helps to reduce prejudice. You work with somebody, you have that one-on-one interaction, you find you might share interests, you have similar styles, you're working towards a goal, and sometimes you even bond a common in-group identity, in contrast to the other group that's working on a different goal, but that seems to be very important in childhood. The third goal is equal status. It's very important to have equal status. A lot of times in the United States when we had integration, we had affluent white children being being integrated with kids from, say, African American children from low income. Well, it's not equal status by socioeconomic status, by income, and so it was often a recipe for disaster. In the child's world, equal status can mean, if you look at a school, who's on the student council, or the president, or the treasurer, who are the leaders in the school? Is that reflecting everybody from different backgrounds? The fourth condition is the one that's the most interesting for us looking at child development, which is friendship. He hypothesized that cross-group friendships would be an important predictor for reducing prejudice. In the adult literature, that has by and far been the #1 predictor for reducing prejudice. When adults have friends from the out-group, from a different race or ethnicity or religion, that helps to reduce prejudice. Why? Well, because you have a friend, you share goals, you share interests, and then when you are exposed to stereotypes from the culture, whether it's from movies, the media, politicians, wherever, you have something to challenge it, something from within you. You know this person isn't like that. So this is interesting because friendship plays a very important role in childhood. It's a foundation for building social skills, empathy, perspective taking, what we call social cognition, cognition about the social world. So we have found this to be the case. We have looked at schools and we've looked at children who report having cross-group friendships and children who do not report it. And children who report having cross-group friendships are more likely to use moral reasoning to explain why exclusion based on race is wrong. They're more likely to use fewer stereotypes. So there seems to be something to this. We still need a lot more research to understand all the complexities of it. So, that's interesting, and that whole theory came from social psychology research with adults, and we meaning developmental psychologists studying these problems, have looked at it for the last 15 years in childhood and found a number of very remarkable, interesting findings to validate it.
Interesting. Also on the prevention front of prejudice and bias, you discussed some educational interventions that can help reduce patterns of discrimination in children. Can you say more about what you take the role of education to be in combating prejudice and bias in children? And also, how effective do you think education programs can be, given that they're operating within a broader social context, which might be reinforcing, these prejudice and bias, actually most likely is reinforcing certain forms of it anyway?
Yeah, it's a good question. Education is a profound context for reducing prejudice. Children spend a very large number of hours every day in school. I think parents often, especially with your first child, have this sort of shocking realization that at some point that your child might spend as much or more time in school as at home. So it's a very intensive and influential environment for everything that happens in child development. It's particularly the case that it also is influential for issues of prejudice. The school climate, there are researchers who look at the climate of a school in terms of this. What does it look like in terms of promoting the importance of diversity, of different cultural backgrounds? You can take something as simple as walking into one school where we've done this. You walk into one school where there's the American flag up and maybe the President of the United States, and then a few other American leaders from the past, and that's what you see. And you go into another school and you see flags from all over the world, and you see maps from all over the world, and you see people from different backgrounds, again, religion, race, ethnicity, gender, who have been made important discoveries in the history of humankind and so forth. Now that's just what's on the wall. And that's pretty, in a way, superficial, but it does symbolize something. And what we find is that there's also a lot more depth to that in terms of the qualitative indices of how teachers are talking to children, including children from different backgrounds, the extent to which teachers ignore kids based on gender and race, the extent to which teachers have expectations about kids, assumptions. We've been working with teaching tolerance in Montgomery, Alabama, and we have a teacher perception tool. And teachers can look at images of adolescents. This one's geared for high school kids. And they can make, we ask them to make judgments about whether this child that they see is going to be nominated for a science award, win the school dance, do their homework, a number of kind of indices that they often have to make assumptions about, predictions about. And when we did that, we varied the clothes and the race and the gender of the children they were making these nominations about. And these are hypothetical children images. And we asked them before they did this, what are the indices that you would use to make a judgment about a child doing well in school? We asked them, would it be gender, race, clothes they wear, how much they do homework, do they pay attention in class? And by and large, 90% of the children, 90% of the teachers pick the last two. And then they go through this task that we give them. They have a lot of decisions to make. And then they get their rating back to them. And what they find, what we've shown, is that by and large they do use gender, race, and the clothes they wear to make judgments about whether they would be nominated for a science award, win the school dance, do their homework, and all kinds of things. So that's just in a hypothetical measure. So, teachers are unaware of this. It's sometimes implicit, but they're unaware of this. So if children are interacting in schools day in, day out, spend a lot of time in schools with a teacher who's got pervasive biases, this is going to be very influential.
So can you say a bit about what you think, or if you do think, there's a specific role for ethics-based education in regards to working against prejudice and bias? And if so, do you support a specific approach that you think is most effective to ethics-based education with young children?
Ethics-based education is essential, important, and has a big impact. And it hasn't been implemented on any large scale in the United States. It's sorely needed. We're at that point in our history where we really need to be doing this in a much more pervasive way. And we need to do it in a way that draws on the empirical literature that has demonstrated what is important about ethics and ethical development and ethics education for children. It's something that should be done very systematically. So I think it's very important. I think it's as important as teaching children math and reading and science. Those things are fundamental, and art and music and ethics. Morality is the core of what it means to be a social being. Morality is about, prescriptive norms of how we ought to treat one another, and it's something that is what enables humans to live together. As one of my primatologist colleagues said to me, primates are social as well, but if you put 8 million primates on an island called Manhattan, they wouldn't live together. What is it that enables us to do that? It's morality. So that's obviously very important, but we don't give it its credit. We don't pay enough attention to it. We think, well, it's what parents do, it's going to happen in the home. But parents aren't always sure about how to do it, just like teaching math. We could say, well, parents should teach children math. Well, some parents would be good at it, some not as good, be very unsystematic. Some have more experience, some parents are young, some parents are older. Some parents have a lot of education, some don't. But in schools, you can regulate it. You have teachers who do have education and they have training. And then it's also, I think, in a lot of ways, more democratic and more fair because all children are getting that kind of education. I believe that's important for science and math, and I also believe it's important for ethics.
Thank you. Speaking of ethics and morality in childhood, in your paper you talk about the spontaneous moral orientation of children. Can you say a bit more about what you mean by this and provide some examples of its presence in childhood?
Spontaneous moral orientation is when you see young children demonstrating a deeply felt concern for the fair treatment of others and equal treatment. And that it's something that's not just taught, it's not that they're saying it because they're going to get a reward or they're going to get a candy bar or something. But it's something that you see them displaying. It usually comes up first, what we see in their peer interactions. It also comes up in parent-child and adult-child interactions as well. But spontaneous moral orientations are important to demonstrate and document because it helps to debunk some very pervasive stereotypes about childhood. What are those stereotypes? Those stereotypes have been traditionally that young children are either a blank slate and they're a sponge and you have to model behavior for them to mimic and imitate. And that has not shown to be how children acquire information or knowledge or an understanding of the world. Another one is that children are egocentric and selfish. They only can take their own perspective and they don't think about others. And that perspective, that viewpoint is quite pervasive. A few years ago, I read a handbook. It was called A Guide to Raising Your Child from Age 0 to 5. And I was interested in it. It was written by a pediatrician as part of the American Medical Association. And there was a section on toddlers. In the toddlers and preschool section, it said, parents, do not try to reason with your child. There's no point to reason or explain issues to your child. Your child will not understand. Your child is going to go through a period of being very egocentric and selfish, and you just have to hold your breath. Don't worry, this too will pass. It wasn't exactly those words, but it was something to that effect. And I remember being very disturbed by this. I actually wrote to the editor of this handbook, and he asked me if I wanted to edit that section, and I said, well, what was the bargain here? I wasn't really sure what he meant by that, but the point is that he liked the feedback, but he didn't change the book. And I did send him a number of references. In fact, I sent him 30 citations from literature that demonstrated how that just was not the case, with large sample sizes of children from many different cultural contexts. So that's a pervasive assumption in the pediatrician's guide to how you raise your children, that they're selfish and egocentric. So this is not helpful because it underestimates children's abilities to think about issues of fairness, number one, underestimates their abilities, and number two, it's a missed opportunity. Because when parents do explain things to children, they learn a lot from it, and it helps to reduce conflict. And one of the interesting findings that I really like is that when you look at peer conflict, peer interactions, and children have conflicts, one of the best strategies for children to reduce their conflict is to use reasons and explanations for what they're doing.
So this is interesting. I mean, even in some of my interactions with some of my colleagues in psychology, one of the discussions that we often have, and I'm curious to talk with them about, I'd love to get your thoughts on it, is given what you just said about children's ability to respond to explanations and engage in reasoned discourse. Do you think there's where is the limit to that? And what I mean by this is that some people will say that you're overshooting the child's capabilities, right? If you are trying to, for instance, do philosophy with children or do ethical discussion with children, because they're just not going to be able to understand what you're saying. And here I'm not talking about, of course, obviously if you went in and delivered a lecture on Aristotle's ethics, then yeah, okay, they're probably, a 6-year-old is not going to understand. But if you're trying to dialogically engage with a child and ask for reasons and provide reasons for a belief or a value that you have or the child has, do you think there's a specific age, for instance, where you think children are generally more capable of that than not? Or do you think that there's a danger sometimes in taking that approach, that you're overshooting the child's capabilities? I guess basically, how do you balance the child's capabilities with your focus on dialogical education about ethics?
It's a really important discussion. And my response to that is comprehension comes before production. Just like with language development, children understand language before they can produce it. Mm-hmm. So the researchers who study language development will always tell you that you should be talking to your babies and to your toddlers and to your children before they can produce language. Because why? Talking to your children introduces them to the sounds of language, the cadence, the rhythm, the reciprocity of the talker and the listener, discourse, dialogue, all the semantics and the communicative functions of language. Well, I think it's the same with morality. I don't think that a child is too young for you to explain things to them and talk to them. I explain things to my cat. Okay, that may be more going to an extreme, but I mean, the point is that I think it's important to explain things to toddlers who may not literally understand exactly what you're talking about, but the fact that you're explaining something to them is something they pick up on, because explanations alone are very important for social and moral development and cognitive development, just the use of explanations. And then, of course, to go to moral explanations is something even more important. Think about it this way. So one child goes over, a toddler, let's say if we take a young one, a toddler goes over and hits their sibling on the head with a sponge or something. So there's different ways the parents can respond. The parent can say in a loud voice, no, don't do that, and yell, and they can be angry, and they can take the child away, and they can hit the child, and they can do all kinds of things. Few parents will hit children now, but that still does happen. That's one approach. Another approach is to do nothing. Another approach is to go over and just say, now, you shouldn't hit him. How will he feel? How would you feel if he hit you? And, when you hit him, do you see he's crying? He's sad. He's not happy. He's crying. And when somebody hits you, you cry too, right? So they may not explain exactly the connection between the acts and consequences, which is what you're trying to do. But they're picking up on the fact that, first of all, you care, that there's something they did that wasn't right, that you want them to change their behavior. They get parts of it. When a child hits somebody and you get angry and hit them or put them in timeout, they're now a victim. They're no longer thinking about that they hit somebody. They're just thinking about now how you did something to them. That's the wrong role for them to be taking. So you're not conveying the right messages when you do that. And of course, if you do nothing, that sends another set of signals that's a problem. So explanations, even if they don't literally understand every word you say, are powerful.
So I'm interested in what sense you would or would not refer to children as moral agents. And part of the reason I'm interested is because of what we just talked about in terms of children's capabilities and their spontaneous moral orientation, for instance. And then what philosophers often think about when they use the term moral agency. Like, so someone who's autonomous, has a sense of self, is a proper subject of blame, and who we will hold responsible for their actions in a robust sense. So I'm wondering, do you use that term with children, or do you think that given those categorizations that I just listed, that it would be proper to refer to children as moral agents or moral agents in development, or how would you think about that?
I take a developmental and differentiated approach to moral agency. So on the one hand, I think babies have moral agency. So as soon as you're born and you have human status, you have moral agency to the extent that there are some rights afforded to you to be taken care of, to be nurtured. So you have rights, that you have desires and wants, that you want to be cared for. Babies come into the world with a lot of biological sort of predispositions to seek a caregiver, to desire proximity to a caregiver. Babies come into the world with a social predisposition. They prefer to look at human faces than non-human faces. So there's moral agency there. Now, I say that I take a differentiated approach because not all those things that go along with moral agency in the adult world should be applied to the child. So you mentioned accountability or blameworthiness. There, I think that wouldn't be appropriate because they don't have the cognitive capacities yet to understand that their actions have consequences to others. I think it begins much earlier than we realize, but nonetheless, they don't have that reflective capacity to understand that, and same with blameworthiness. So those aspects I would reserve for later when children understand more of the connections between acts and consequences. But moral agency, I think, appropriately applies to any human being, and that's true from the first day of life.
So I'm interested in this distinction between moral agency and then being able to be blamed for your actions, right? How responsible you are, and I think agency and then forms of responsibility can be differentiated. But I'm also interested in the fact that when we talk about perhaps with the 8-year-old, for instance, maybe not blaming them for an action the way we would a 18-year-old, right?
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense to differentiate that. But the flip side is if an 8-year-old is not a proper subject of blame, right, in a moral sense, then can they also at the same time be a proper subject of praise? And the reason I ask this is that it seems like in some cases we want to say that children are not blameworthy for actions they do wrong, but then when we look at, for instance, examples from this civil rights movement, the American Civil Rights Movement, where children as young as 6 were actively taking part in protests, 6, 7, 8, and on up. And in some cases, we're saying why they were doing it, and we want to praise them for those actions. But do you think that if we say that we can't blame children, that it would also entail that we can't praise them for the same reason, that they don't have the understanding, supposedly, of acts and consequences?
Yeah, I don't see them as contingent. I don't think they're contingent. I think you can, I think it's important not to hold them accountable for actions that they don't understand. Maybe it has to do with what actions we're talking about and what their level of comprehension is about that. That we don't hold them accountable for, say, infliction of harm on another if they don't realize that there was harm, that they were committing harm. But there's plenty of things we do hold 8-year-olds accountable for, right? So, and again, it has to do with if you hold them accountable for it, what's the consequence? I think in most cases with children, we still want the outcome. The rehabilitation should be education and counseling, not imprisonment, right? So, although I actually think that applies to adults as well. I think, we need more rehabilitation than just imprisonment. But so I think that has to be a continuum on that in terms of the accountability. But I think the praiseworthiness is a little bit different. I don't see those as symmetrical because I think that we want to acknowledge when 8-year-olds or when children are doing things that have a moral motivation. So I guess the symmetry is it depends on what it is. So an 8-year-old, we would praise them for being morally motivated to care about others in a particular way where they not direct benefit to the self in terms of thinking about preventing others' harm, and that's something to praise them for. And we'd hold them accountable for inflicting harm and say another on a peer. But we just have to be careful in that case to ensure that we know that they understood what they were doing. And maybe the flip side is that if they are, it's why I'm reserved about certain forms of character education, because if you're mandating that children volunteer and help in the community, then how much of that is really something that we should praise them for when they're sort of being mandated to do it. So that maybe is the flip side of it. It isn't coming from within.
Right.
So if the action is coming from within and is to do good for others and help them, then we want to acknowledge that. Mm-hmm. And if from within they're doing something that causes harm, we want to deal with that too. Mm-hmm. So I think they're both complex constructs that aren't always symmetrical.
Yeah. So you mentioned during your lunch seminar, we talked a little bit about Piaget and Kohlberg, mm-hmm. and their understanding of morality is developing through major stages. In your own characterization of moral development and the child's progression towards moral maturity, if you're not discussing that in terms of stages, how do you generally characterize kind of the milestones in that progression, or do you use that terminology, or do you think of it in a different way?
Yeah, we have an alternative theory to a general stage model, but that doesn't mean we don't think there is development within the moral domain. There is development within the moral domain. The stage concept had this notion that young children, for example, do not, maybe are punishment avoidant, and they do acts to avoid getting in trouble. And the problem, limitation of that characterization of childhood is that it's across the board. In any context, they would be punishment avoidant. So a stage system proposes that a person's thinking about a set of issues is going to be the case regardless of what the issue is. Across all issues that they come in contact with in their life, they have this certain template for thinking about it. And what we have found just over and over again is that's just not the case, because there's so many different contexts with many variables that kids encounter. So maybe there's a few contexts where kids think, yeah, if I don't get in trouble, I should do this. Just like adults might speed on the highway if they think they're not going to get caught. But that doesn't mean that because they speed on the highway, they might not get caught, doesn't mean that they think it's okay to steal from my neighbor because I won't get caught. They don't have this template they're using across all contexts, neither do children. Right? So children don't have one template they use to evaluate all actions. Now, so your question is a good one. Then what does develop within the moral domain? What we argue, and what we've tried to demonstrate, I think pretty successfully in a number of studies, is that what develops is the ability to coordinate different considerations. So different considerations within the moral realm, because you have issues of avoiding harm, you have issues of fair distribution of resources, you have issues of rights, you have issues of inclusion. So those are a lot of different issues, and those are within the moral domain. But there's lots of social considerations, what we would call, that are distinct from the moral domain. Conventions, customs, rituals, conventions we have for organizing ourselves as groups, in a classroom, everybody sits in lecture seats, but you could organize it differently and everybody could just stand up, or you could sit in a circle outside. I mean, there's lots of different ways you can do it. We have lots of conventions throughout our society. Kids have conventions too. They have a lot of conventions for organizing themselves. So what develops? Well, if you have a decision you have to make about something, it often involves multiple considerations. Well, for young children, this is really hard. So for young children, if they're confronted with some kind of situation that's what we call multifaceted, they might just focus on one issue and one issue only. Whereas with age, what happens is kids are weighing a number of different considerations. They're saying, well, the group doesn't want to do this, and we kind of have to make sure the group stays together. But it might be unfair if only one person gets to talk at a time. Then so let's figure out how we can do this so it's both fair but also preserves the group identity. Or there's a convention you have to line up before you go outside for recess. That's a convention. You could do it another way. But if somebody cuts in front of the line, that's unfair because everybody else behind you has been waiting. So that's a multifaceted issue in the child's world. The convention of wait in line, the unfairness of cutting in front of somebody else. So kids start to see, well, yeah, maybe it's silly that we have to stand in line, but it's unfair if you deny somebody else their turn, they've been waiting longer. So it's the being able to consider multiple dimensions of any given problem or issue that is complex for kids. Sometimes I give the example of if you have a ball and you roll it down the hallway, when you roll that ball down the hallway, there's temporal features, time, there's causal features, the rolling, there's spatial features, there's a lot of different properties from the physical world that are operating. And you have to understand the ball rolling down, you have to sort of know that all those are going on, and you have to be able to eventually to understand them all to explain why the ball rolls down the hallway. Mm-hmm. Sort of like with moral issues, like with social issues, social conflicts, there's a lot of things going on. How do you pull apart all those different issues and weigh each one? That's hard.
Right, that's interesting. So along with moving away from the general template of stage theory as you were describing it, do you also move away from the generalizations about the specific ages at which, for instance, say, these multifaceted skills start to come into play? Or do you often think of your work, well, this general age is around when this happens, and this general age is around when it's not yet present? Do you make those kinds of distinctions, or do you think those aren't really particularly helpful?
They are helpful. It is important to see age-related changes, and it is important to look at sort of the benchmarks that go on development, because the biological changes, the cognitive changes, the brain changes, the neuroscience changes, neuroscientific changes, physiological changes, those are all happening too, and they feed into the ability that we have to make judgments and to make decisions and to evaluate acts and so forth. So especially changes in the brain, in terms of how we process information. So there are, and we do identify them, not as I was going to say not as rigidly as stage theorists, although Piaget was the first one to say that there are no ages magically associated with each stage, but in the textbooks that was never the case. It was always, this stage is at 5 to 8 years of age, and this stage is, he always says, a developmental process for any given child. But I think that there are, the research has shown that there are phenomena, there are ways in which children understand issues that change. So we think of 3 to 6 year olds seem to be having certain, part of it's exposure. They have interactions with peers in certain contexts, and they understand them. And then something seems to change between 7 and 10 years of age. And then when they move into different school environments and adolescence, something again changes. So there are clearly age groupings in the kinds of abilities we see and document. We don't yet have that shaded gray box in the textbook to identify exactly how you coordinate at different ages. But if you put it all together, there's a pretty good, I think, robust body of evidence to show what's sort of happening at these different ages.
So in your report, you mentioned that children's worlds reflect hierarchies that are distinct from and similar to the adult world. Can you tell me a bit more about the presence of these hierarchies in the child's world and how it's similar and different from adult hierarchies?
For a long time, we've known that hierarchies play out in children's world in terms of children who are bullies and children who are victims and children who are popular and children who are neglected and rejected. So there's been a lot of research for a long time on these hierarchies that play out that are associated with status. So the popular children, what makes some children popular and what makes some children rejected and what makes some children bullies. So there's a lot of research on the individual differences and factors that go into that whole, what's called sociometry, the sociometry of the child's world. And so to some extent that's similar with adulthood, and that you see hierarchies. But the hierarchies and the status that we've been most interested in the last 15 years are different. They're not so much those personality factors that go into who's popular, who's a bully, who's a victim, but more hierarchies are associated with status and power. And the parallel with the adult world to the child world, in the adult world, there's status and hierarchy in terms of power. And that's often associated with race and gender, ethnicity, nationality, money, other socioeconomic status, of course. So that's there, and it has a lot to do with movement and mobility in positions of power in countries, in politics, in government, in technology and education. So what's interesting is we can see some of that in the child's world too. So not just who's a bully or a victim because of their personality, but who is excluded or included because of the status they have. And that can be on race, and it can be on socioeconomic status, and it can be on gender. And really trying to understand that in a much more in-depth way. What do children think about that? Do they think it's all right to exclude somebody who's poor? Is it all right to exclude the girls from soccer? Or soccer would not be an example now on the child's level. That's been more integrated, but obviously football would be a better example now. Is it all right to exclude the boys from ballet? And so, we're trying to understand that a lot more and look at the morality of that. Look at the morality of inclusion, exclusion, based on those categories which come from the adult world. Now, when I say they come from the adult world, it doesn't mean because children are mimicking what they see in the adult world. It just means that those kinds of categories are there very early. It's actually that they start early because of this notion of the in-group and the out-group and the markers that you associate with who's in the out-group. So they start early and they evolve. And if left untouched or if left without some recognition of it, I think it does contribute to much more serious and negative outcomes by adulthood. One of the things we know very well is that stereotypes are deeply entrenched by adulthood. Very hard to change. Children it's just coming online. For children, they're just figuring them out. They're just starting to make the association. So if you want to intervene and make a difference, you have to do it in childhood.